didn't really want to do anything. I had probably started recording my, I may have recorded one. That's just never been my thing in my life, in my career, especially after.
Faith Evans, a name the entire United States once bowed to in admiration. The First Lady of Bad Boy. The gold standard of classic R&B. But what happens when one of the biggest pop stars on the planet stops? When the hits no longer arrive? When albums disappear? Replaced instead by cold headlines, arrested for possession of cocaine and marijuana, followed by domestic violence allegations involving her own husband. Faith's battle with addiction played out publicly in courtrooms across tabloid covers and left shattered relationships in its wake. But that was never the whole story. Now Faith Evans is sending shockwaves through the entertainment industry by revealing a truth buried for more than 20 years. And trust me, once these secrets come to light, you will begin to understand just how rotten and decayed life in Hollywood really is. Are you ready? Origins. Pure talent. Before the name Faith Evans was dragged into battles she did not create, before the media learned to compress her life into a few easy-to-digest headlines, Faith existed as something very different. An original talent, no borrowed scandal, no borrowed spotlight, and certainly not a disposable product of any system. Born in Lakeland, Florida, and raised in New Jersey, she moved to Los Angeles in 1991 with the dream of becoming a professional recording singer. Church was where she refined and trained her gift. By 1994, at just 21 years old, Faith reached a rare milestone when she became the first female artist signed to Sean Puff Daddy Combs' Bad Boy Records. It was a label built around muscular talents like Craig Mack and the notorious B.I.G., a roster heavy with testosterone. Faith's debut album, released in 1995, showcased a voice critics compared to legends such as Minnie Riperton and Chaka Khan. The album earned critical praise and moderate commercial success, establishing Faith as a formidable presence in R&B. Her refined vocal style and songwriting ability set her apart from her peers, opening the door to what looked like a long, radiant career. At that moment, everything felt like magic. Faith was not just a singer, she was the architect of the bad boy sound. But fame carried complications that would shape the rest of her life. In an environment where power and gender were inseparable, a young woman becoming the first lady of Bad Boy raised unspoken questions. Some whispered she was favored. Others implied talent alone was not enough. These rumors needed no proof. They existed simply because Faith was a woman, and because she entered a space long governed by male logic. Bad Boy and Me, when love and power share a room. During a Bad Boy photo shoot in August 1994, Faith met Christopher Wallace, better known as the notorious B.I.G. Both were 21 years old, and they made a decision that outsiders saw as reckless. They married after just 9 days of knowing each other. Two artists on the same label swept into an intense romance that would later become one of the most complicated love stories in hip-hop history. That marriage only tightened the web between Faith Diddy and Bad Boy. It was no longer just music. It was family business and legacy. The pressure of being married to one of the biggest rappers of that era, combined with relentless media scrutiny and industry maneuvering, created a perfect storm for personal collapse. And conflict arrived early. Not vague rumors, but Biggie's public extramarital relationships, most notably his ongoing affair with rapper Lil' Kim. Not a one-time mistake, but a pattern that lasted at least a year and a half. Faith did not just hear about it, she witnessed it. On Christmas night, Faith found Biggie and Lil' Kim in the same bed. A physical confrontation followed. Faith pulled Lil' Kim out of the bed. A moment raw, ugly, and completely at odds with the golden couple image the public wanted to believe in. From that point on, the marriage was almost beyond saving. Faith was forced to live two lives at once, publicly defending her husband to the media, while privately swallowing humiliation. Every argument, every separation, every reconciliation was dissected by tabloids like a new episode of a show. Not because they cared about Faith, but because tragedy sells. As if the chaos were not enough, Tupac Shakur entered the picture. In 1995, Faith and Tupac met while working on the song "Wonder Why They Call You Bitch." According to Faith's later statements to the press, it was strictly professional. Nothing more, nothing less. No romance, no secrecy. Just a recording session, a job. She later admitted she had no idea the session took place at Death Row Records, and the experience left her feeling manipulated and exploited. Recording with Tupac further strained her marriage to Biggie and poured fuel on the East Coast-West Coast conflict. Already at odds with Biggie, Tupac chose Faith as a point of attack. He claimed he had slept with her, turning the allegation into a weapon on the infamous diss track Hit 'Em Up, a strike aimed not at music, but at honor. Faith denied everything. She stated clearly that Tupac was not transparent about money. He promised to pay $25,000 for the recording. But when Faith went to the hotel to collect, she did not receive a check. She received crude propositions. Stay the night, then get paid. Faith refused and walked out. When Tupac later doubled down on claims of a romantic relationship with Faith, it became yet another weapon in the war between the two camps. Faith consistently maintained these claims were false, but the damage to her reputation and marriage was irreversible. By 1997, everything ended in the most brutal way possible. Biggie was in Los Angeles, a tragedy that shook the world. Faith, now a widow and a mother, was completely shattered. The pain was unbearable. And while the world mourned, only Faith understood the cost of being forced to sing through that pain. I'll be missing you. Success, built on pain. The death of the notorious B.I.G. did not just take Faith Evans' husband. It destroyed the entire emotional framework she relied on to survive. Faith collapsed and began searching for any form of comfort that would help her make it through each day. On the very night Biggie died, she turned to Todd Rusaw, a music executive. The relationship did not begin with romance, but with survival. It gave Faith temporary stability, while opening the door to a new set of challenges she was not emotionally prepared to face. Before Faith could even bury her grief, Diddy pulled her back into the studio. Not with gentleness, but with the industry's familiar logic. He proposed that Faith record I'll Be Missing You, a tribute to Biggie, built on the melody of Every Breath You Take by The Police. The song was raw, direct, filled with unprocessed emotion. It was not born from long-term strategy, but from a moment so painful that no defenses remained. The track became an instant hit, #1 for weeks. Global airplay, millions of dollars generated. On paper, it was a perfect success story. But behind the scenes, it was anything but poetic. Every time Faith stepped on stage to sing the song, she was not performing. She was being forced to relive the moment of losing Biggie over and over in front of thousands of eyes hungry for emotion. The public wanted a strong widow. The industry wanted an icon who could turn tragedy into product. Meanwhile, Faith was still breaking apart. The paradox is that despite delivering one of the most haunting and beautiful vocal performances of her career, Faith later revealed she was not properly credited or compensated. The tribute touched millions, but for Faith, it was a cold transaction. She poured her pain into the microphone. Others collected the money. One woman lost her husband. One system profited. Faith was not alone in seeing this. Years later, singer Jaguar Wright publicly accused Diddy of exploiting Biggie's legacy like an endless resource. In an interview, she said what many in the industry only dared whisper: "Puffy has made money off Biggie longer than Biggie was alive. Biggie lived 24 years. But more than 25 years after his death, the name continues to be monetized: tribute concerts, reissued albums, documentaries, fashion lines, anniversary projects. And almost always, Diddy appears as executive producer or creative director. Legacy became an assembly line. Pain became an asset. Over time, Faith began using drugs as a way to numb the pain and constant anxiety that followed her. At first, occasionally, then more frequently. Not to feel good, but to feel nothing at all. Substances offered temporary escape, just enough to carry her from one performance to the next recording session. By the early 2000s, drug use began seriously impacting Faith's career. She missed recording sessions, showed up unprepared for performances, and gradually earned a reputation for being unreliable. The woman, once known for discipline and professionalism, now made industry partners cautious. The substances she used, from marijuana to others, created unpredictable effects on her behavior and judgment. They gave her energy for the stage while allowing her to disappear in the quiet moments. Bad Boy executives noticed the shift. The album Keep the Faith, released in 1998, was still successful, But the recording process was far more difficult than her debut. Faith required more takes, struggled to focus, and frequently had to reschedule. The industry's response was brutally pragmatic. As long as Faith continued to deliver hits, they would work around her issues. But everyone understood one thing. Faith Evans was no longer treated as a grieving human being. She was being operated as a money-making machine. And that machine was starting to overload. Court appearances and an unforgiving blade. On January 27, 2004, Faith was driving through Hapeville, Georgia. A completely ordinary day in the most literal sense. No stage, no studio, no lights, just a stretch of road and a car. Police pulled her over for a temporary license plate that was improperly displayed. An administrative violation thousands of people commit every day. But for Faith, that moment became a turning point for an entire chapter of her life. The stop escalated quickly. The amount of drugs found was described as very small. Not enough to constitute a major criminal case, but enough to saddle Faith with serious charges, possession of cocaine and marijuana. She was taken to the Fulton County Jail. Not because of the danger of the act, but because of procedure. Procedure does not care who you are. The media, however, cares very much. Within hours, the arrest became national news. No one asked about context. No one asked what Faith had been through before that moment. Headlines like "Faith Evans arrested on drug charges" flooded entertainment sites. Her story was framed as a moral lesson about the dark side of the hip-hop lifestyle. A personal misstep was turned into evidence for an entire collective stereotype. Faith was released on bail after posting $12,000. Legally, it was a small step. Publicly, the damage was immediate. Radio stations began hesitating to play her music. Promoters grew cautious. Record label executives kept a safe distance from a name now tied to controversy. No one announced a cutoff. They simply went silent. And in this industry, silence is often the most polite form of retreat. Faith's attorney, Vincent Eldemick, moved quickly. He called the charges absurd, insisting his client had never possessed drugs. It was a familiar defensive reflex in the early days of a crisis. But evidence existed, and Faith herself later acknowledged that she had experimented with drugs during that period. Not in the way the media portrayed it, but enough to make total denial impossible to sustain. Rather than prolong the legal fight, Faith agreed to enter a 13-week treatment program. This was a standard procedure for first-time nonviolent offenders in Fulton County. Completing the program meant the charges would be dismissed. On paper, it was a reasonable exit. Psychologically, it was a hard pill to swallow. It meant Faith had to admit not to the court, but to herself that she needed help. Treatment was anything but simple, especially for a public figure. Faith could not attend group therapy as an anonymous patient. Her presence always drew attention, curiosity, and side conversations. The media hovered. Every movement risked becoming tabloid fodder. While the goal of treatment was confrontation and recovery, Faith had to build additional layers of defense just to avoid being torn apart outside. Completing the 13-week program allowed Faith to avoid a criminal record. The charges were dismissed. No jail time, no lasting conviction. But anyone who thinks the story ended there underestimates the weight of public shame. The legal work closed. The work of recovery was just beginning. Faith understood that sobriety is not a destination, but a condition that must be maintained every day in a world that never stops replaying old mistakes. What matters is that there was no evidence Faith was a severe addict in the medical sense the media often implied. No pattern of serious repeat offenses, no prison sentences. But the label of fallen had already been firmly attached, and once that label exists, every future action is interpreted through it. By 2010, Faith became involved in a DUI case in California and received probation. Once again, not prison. Not a legal catastrophe, but enough for the media to reinforce the story they were already telling. To them, it was proof of a pattern, a female artist in decline. To Faith, it was part of a personal struggle that never unfolded on fair terms. The injustice here was not in the law. It was in the language society chose. A man in hip-hop could be called a bad boy, a wild, rebellious figure admired in a distorted way. But a woman with similar behavior would be labeled a problem, a liability, a burden, someone who needed to be controlled. Faith Evans did not fall because of a sentence. She fell because of the collective gaze. A quiet fall, one that did not imprison the body, but suffocated image opportunity and the right to fail like an ordinary human being. And at the bottom of that fall, Faith was forced to learn the hardest lesson of her career in this industry. Standing back up requires not only talent, but the patience to survive judgments you never deserved. Leaving Diddy at the turn of the century. After nearly a decade of attachment, Bad Boy was no longer the place where Faith found herself. It was where she had loved, lost, succeeded, been hurt, and been bound to a story that no longer belonged to her alone. There, Faith was not just an artist, she was Biggie's widow, a symbol of tragedy. The emotional component brought out whenever the label needed to revisit its golden past. And over time, Faith realized that to survive in that ecosystem, she would have to keep playing a role she no longer had the strength to carry. Leaving Bad Boy did not mean denying what came before. Faith understood that clearly. This was where she had her biggest hits, the milestones any R&B singer dreams of. But it was also where she was most heavily boxed in. Every piece of music Faith released was heard through a familiar filter. People did not ask, "What is Faith saying?" They asked, "How does this relate to Biggie?" And when an artist is no longer allowed to speak in her own voice, that is when she begins to disappear, even while still standing on stage. The decision to leave Bad Boy was Faith's way of breaking that chain. No longer at the center of an empire powered by memory, she stepped outside, where there were fewer lights, but also fewer whispers. And interestingly, the moment she left the biggest spotlight, Faith began to be seen more clearly as an independent individual. The album The First Lady was born in that context. From the title alone, Faith made her intention clear. First Lady was no longer a title assigned by Bad Boy or by her marriage to Biggie. It was the name Faith chose for herself, a reclamation of language, no crowning, no validation required. The album did not chase scandal. It did not try to answer the past. It was simply Faith, more mature, more cautious, and more deliberate in telling her own story. More importantly, Faith no longer had to argue for her existence. She did not speak out to rebut every rumor. She did not rush into media battles to restore her image. She understood that the more she reacted, the more she would be dragged back into the very vortex she had just escaped. Instead, Faith chose selective silence, choosing where to appear, choosing which projects to join, choosing when to speak and when not to. It was a different kind of power, quieter, but far more durable. Many in the industry looked at this period and labeled Faith as past her prime. Fewer hits, fewer appearances, fewer chart mentions. But that was the perspective of people who measure artists by noise. For Faith, this was the period when she had the most control over her life. Not because she had nothing left to lose, but because she was finally no longer required to represent things that were never hers. There is a clear paradox in this story. When Faith was no longer at the center of the spotlight, she was finally able to be Faith. No longer expected to represent someone else's legacy. No longer dragged out as proof of an era. No longer burdened with the contradictory expectations placed on women in hip-hop. She returned to her original role, a working artist living with music accountable for her own choices. The relief of this phase did not come from things becoming easier. It came from things becoming clearer. Faith knew where she stood, knew what she wanted, and most importantly knew she no longer had to chase a story written by someone else. Hope in this case was not the hope of returning to an old peak. It was the hope of continuing forward at her own pace, without being pulled back into the past every time someone needed a legend to retell. Leaving Bad Boy Faith Evans did not lose her name. She reclaimed it. And in an industry that prefers to keep artists locked into familiar roles, a woman daring to step out of the part built around her pain may be the bravest act she ever performed. 2020, domestic violence. The lowest point. When Faith Evans reconnected with Stevie J, it was not a random encounter. The two had known each other since the 1990s, back when Bad Boy was at its peak. Stevie was not just a talented producer, he was someone who understood this ecosystem, understood how fame operates, understood the pressure of living under the lights and being scrutinized with every breath. For Faith, at a time when she was exhausted from having to explain herself to the world, that understanding felt like a lifeline. The relationship began quietly moving from friendship into romance. No noise, no grand announcements. But like many times before, when Faith believed she had found a safe place, she placed her bet very quickly. In 2018, Faith and Stevie J suddenly got married in Las Vegas. No long-term planning, no emotional preparation. A wedding that took place right in a hotel room, catching both friends and family completely off guard. For Faith, it was hope, a new beginning, a way to believe that this time would be different. But the problem was not the ceremony, it was the pattern. This marriage quickly revealed familiar cracks. Both Faith and Stevie carried complicated personal histories, unresolved trauma, and coping habits that involved hurting each other. Jealousy, suspicion, and arguments became part of daily life. Drama no longer stayed behind the scenes. It spilled directly onto social media. Vague posts, unfollows, half-joking, half-serious remarks were enough for the public to understand that this was not a stable marriage. At times, Stevie publicly implied that Faith was cheating, then later walked it back, saying it was just something in his head. But those statements, even when retracted, left scars. They revealed a relationship operating on suspicion rather than trust. And when suspicion becomes the foundation, every argument has the potential to spiral out of control. The breaking point came in the early morning of May 30th, 2020. Police were called to their Los Angeles home after a heated argument. The dispute escalated into physical violence. When officers arrived, they observed scratches and visible marks on Stevie J's face. Under those circumstances, they had little choice. Faith Evans was arrested on felony domestic violence charges. This was the lowest point. No longer drugs, no longer personal mistakes. Domestic violence carries a different weight. It destroys an image faster and deeper than any previous scandal. To the public, this was proof that Faith had gone too far. To Faith, it was the moment when all the old trauma collapsed into a single explosion. The charges were later dropped when Stevie refused to testify. He said he never wanted Faith to be arrested. He only called the police, hoping the situation would cool down. But the system does not operate on intent, it operates on evidence. And the marks on his face determined the rest of that night. Legally, the case ended fairly quickly. Emotionally, it left a deep crater. Despite everything, Faith and Stevie still tried to reconcile. Stevie publicly declared his love for his wife, stated he was not leaving, and even revealed that they were making music together. Music once again became the familiar lifeline. But this time, it was not enough. The core issues were never resolved. Pressure, the past addiction, and unhealthy coping mechanisms continued to collide in the same space. In November 2021, Stevie J filed for divorce. After 3 years together, after a domestic violence case, after multiple failed attempts at reconciliation, Faith's third marriage closed, leaving yet another marker of failure in her search for stability through relationships. Looking back, this was not an incident, not a single isolated accident. It was the sum of more than 20 years of unhealed trauma. Every relationship in Faith's life began with immense hope, then gradually slipped into chaos, public shame, and collapse. That cycle does not say Faith is weak. It says she tried to heal her deepest wounds through love, when what she truly needed was recovery from within. Aftermath, success, but never complete on paper. Faith Evans' life. After all the upheaval, is an undeniable success story. More than 20 million records sold worldwide. Her hits still appear regularly in playlists across generations. A Grammy stands as official proof that her voice is not just memory,
wasn't
but a
always
value
aligned
stamped
with
by the
it was
industry.
about
But those
clarity.
numbers never tell the full story. Because every time Faith reappears before the public, the past arrives one step ahead of her. She does not step onto the stage as a pure artist, but as someone carrying a heavy history on her back. People do not ask what she is creating
In
next.
a rare and
They
candid
ask if she is
2020
okay.
interview, Faith spoke
They ask
out.
if she has moved on.
She felt that some of
They
the
ask about
tributes
things that
missed the
happened
mark.
decades ago, as if her life froze at the moment of that first loss. Her memoir, Keep the Faith, was born in that context. Not as a shocking confession, and not as a loud defense. It was written in the measured voice of someone long accustomed to weighing every
She didn't
word.
call out any
Faith tells
individuals
her
by
story,
name, careful
but
not
always
to
stops
ignore.
just
The message
before
was
the
clear.
dangerous line.
The legacy
No table flipping, no finger pointing, no names called. Just enough fragments for the reader to understand that what the public saw was only the very tip of the iceberg. That restraint makes Faith's story even more haunting, because it shows
Her
that
voice
she did not
resonated
just
with
survive
fans
the
and
upheaval,
insiders
she learned how to
alike,
protect herself
felt the
in a
same
world
tension
that was
between
never truly
remembrance
safe.
and business.
Fame is no longer something to flaunt. It became something to guard, to monitor, to defend against. Every media appearance requires Faith not only to represent her music, but to protect her image, protect her history, and protect the silences that
For
took
Faith,
decades to build.
it was about
In
reclaiming
her
Biggie's
50s,
truth,
Faith
sometimes
Evans no longer chases
exploitative.
the spotlight. She chooses when to appear, chooses when it feels safe to speak, and chooses silence when she understands that silence causes the least harm. That is not avoidance. It is a survival skill, forged through years of scrutiny.
To others,
judgment,
it was a
and
reflection
being
of faith
dragged
in
back
an
into the
industry where
past.
words are
If
currency.
you look at the entire
Faith's
journey, Faith was never just a singer. She was not only the widow of a legend, or a woman who struggled with addiction. She was a woman who stepped into the spotlight far too young before she could understand the true cost of that light. And much of her
She
adult
talked
life
about the
was not
unfair
about
contracts,
shining,
feeling
but about
exploited,
learning how to
and
stand
insiders say
without
she was
being burned
protecting
alive.
herself, keeping
Fame did not save her. Talent did not shield her. The only thing that allows Faith Evans to still be standing today is her ability to adapt, endure, and pull herself out of vortices that could have swallowed anyone else. And the cost of that survival
behind
is
the
something no
scenes.
chart,
Quiet
no
fight
award,
happening
and
behind
no
the
sales figure can ever measure.
Today's content may reference public figures, businesses, or social events. However, all mentions are intended for exploratory purposes only and are not meant as accusations or judgments. Stories like this, they leave a mark. If you want to keep digging into the truth and honor the legends, make sure you hit that subscribe button. You are now locked in with the Black Vault. What's your take on this? Let me know in the comments.